Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to discuss one-dimensional thinking by climate alarmists. Laura Tobin is a weather presenter for Good Morning Britain. She is likely seen on television by millions of people. She made this tweet earlier today. The impacts of climate change are becoming more visible. I visited Tyrol, the largest ski resort in Austria, for an international weather summit, where glaciers have been shrinking at an alarming rate and could be nearly gone sooner than you'd think. The UN declares a climate emergency. The UN has recently declared a climate emergency due to the rate of global temperature rise linked to record greenhouse gas concentrations. So I responded to her. Most glacial shrinkage in Austria occurred before 1950. This is a natural process which has been going on for most of the last 20,000 years and has nothing to do with climate change. Why spread baseless propaganda, Laura? The image I sent her was from National Geographic in November 1976. The article had 4 pictures of glaciers in Austria: 1903, 1929, 1940, and 1956. You can see that there was a lot of glacial loss between 1903 and 1929, much more by 1940, and by 1956 it was almost all gone. 20,000 years ago, glaciers completely filled up these valleys. The article discussed extensively the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, which have since been erased by Michael Mann. And down here in the lower right corner is some very important text. Glacial retreat high in the Austrian Alps marks the abnormal warmth that prevailed in the first half of this century. That's a very important concept which I'm going to be referring to several times in this video. The first half of the 20th century was very warm. The paragraph also said that by 1940, 650-foot thick ice had nearly disappeared. Now let's look at some newspaper articles about what was going on with the weather in the first half of the century. In 1958, the New York Times said the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. In 1955, it was reported that Arctic sea ice had lost half of its area. In 1954, it was reported that Earth had warmed 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the past 100 years, and that the temperature around Spitsbergen during winter had warmed an incredible 19 degrees since 1910. In 1952, it was reported that the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and threatened to swamp seaports by raising ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. In 1947, it was reported that if the Greenland ice cap continued melting at its current rate, people living in the lowlands along the shores would be inundated. Dr. Ullman added that temperatures in the Arctic have increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. In 1940, it was reported that the ice of the Arctic Ocean is melting so rapidly that more than 1/3 of it has disappeared in 50 years. In 1939, it was reported that the eastern Arctic was warming up 1 degree every 2 years, and that since 1910, winter temperatures had increased by nearly 16 degrees. It was also reported in 1939 by the world's leading Arctic expert that all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. It may without exaggeration be said that the Greenland glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. 1939 was also the year of one of Australia's worst heat waves. In 1935, the Geologic Survey reported that the glaciers of the United States were melting away faster than ever. In 1930, it was reported that the alpine glaciers of Switzerland were in full retreat. In 1923, scientists predicted that the glaciers in Glacier National Park would be gone in 25 years. That would have been 1948. In 1922, the Monthly Weather Review reported a radical change in climatic conditions in the Arctic and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. In 1910, scientists reported that glaciers were retreating to the mountains all over the world. They discussed the Arapaho Glacier, which is my local glacier here in Colorado. They said it's been melting at a rapid rate for several years. In 1903, it was reported that alpine glaciers have long been in the process of recession. And the same thing for Greenland glaciers, which were conclusively shown to be receding. In 1902, it was reported that alpine glaciers were disappearing, and that the famous glaciers of the Rhone have shrunk several thousand feet in the last 20 years. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were very low in 1902, so it's pretty clear that the recession of Austrian glaciers has nothing to do with carbon dioxide. Laura Tobin didn't do any research, she's simply parroting propaganda to millions of people. Now let's go back to the 1976 National Geographic article. Remember, they discussed the abnormal warmth that prevailed in the first half of the 20th century. This was the 1974 global temperature graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research right here in Boulder, Colorado. It showed a tremendous amount of warming during the first half of the 20th century, and then a lot of very fast cooling after that. We've already looked at a lot of newspaper articles discussing the warmth prior to 1950. Now let's look at the cooling which occurred after that. The article on the left is the same 1976 National Geographic article we were looking at before. From 1880 to about 1940, the world, particularly the northern hemisphere, went through a period of significant warming. But since about 1940, there's been a distinct drop in average global temperature. It's fallen about half a degree Fahrenheit, even more on the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966, Hubert Lamb has noted. In the northern tier of the U.S. Midwest, summer frosts again occasionally damage crops. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. During the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen, irregularly at first but more sharply over the last decade. U.S. National Science Board, 1974. Glaciers in Alaska and Scandinavia have slowed the recession. Some in Switzerland have begun advancing again. And here are some newspaper articles from the cooling period. 1961. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point: the Earth is getting colder. 1963. Norway's glaciers are in the process of becoming thicker again after a period of 200 years of gradually melting down. 1970. New York Times. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. Now let's compare what we've read to the 1974 NCAR graph. They show glaciers disappearing and melting when it's warm, and they show glaciers growing and Iceland blocked with ice when it's cold. This graph makes perfect sense. Now let's compare the historical record to the current NASA graph, which looks very different. NASA's current graph shows glaciers melting when it's cold, and they show ice forming when it's warm. This graph makes absolutely no sense. One of the ClimateGate emails from 10 years ago shows that climate scientists colluded to get rid of the warmth of the 1940s. From Tom Wigley at NCAR to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, copied Ben Santer of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. So if we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So the scientists made the decision to get rid of the 1940s warmth without even having any justification for why they were doing it. And that's why the current NASA graph makes no sense. It's propaganda, not science. Laura Tobin from Good Morning Britain is parroting propaganda to millions of people. This is a picture of an ice cube which is melting. Can you tell from looking at the picture whether the temperature in the room is warming up, cooling down, or staying the same? You can't make that determination. The only conclusion you can reach is that the air temperature in the room is above freezing. Temperatures in the room could be dropping quite quickly and the ice cube would still be melting. Laura Tobin is engaged in one-dimensional thinking. She sees the glaciers melting in Austria and assumes that means the climate is warming up. But as we just saw, that sort of conclusion is not supportable. The only valid conclusion you can reach from the fact that a glacier is disappearing is that there's less snow falling in winter than is melting in summer. You can't tell anything about whether the climate is warming up or cooling down. Science requires that people actually think and that they actually do research. Parroting propaganda is not science. And it's not journalism either. All that it is propaganda. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.